he doesn't care how much he trashes, how much he lies, how many institutions he craps on, as long as he, Boris, manages to continue with his weird cult. I think he's definitely proved that he's dangerous now. I think
Yes.
there's absolutely no doubt about that. And I think he's dangerous because he is challenging the Constitution again and again. He's challenging all the things that Parliament, the courts, everything that's supposed to protect us against politicians.
This is a point which is, I mean, you won't be surprised to learn, I think absolutely crucial and possibly getting overlooked because we can go back to the prorogation, we can go back to the Owen Paterson story, we can go back to the resignation of ethics advisors, the refusal to reappoint. There was, and because he's so chaotic, it's hard to say with confidence that it was concerted, but there were certainly repeated and consistent attempts to trash the institutions that essentially hold everything together.
And it's very weird because he campaigned for Brexit on the saying the reason he was doing it was for parliamentary sovereignty. We were going to leave the European Union, we were going to restore British institutions, Parliament, the court. But actually, what he's done is every time they've criticized him or in any way stood in his way, he's gone on to rubbish them. And it makes it feel as though the only thing that matters, obviously, to him is himself. I mean, and he doesn't care how much he trashes, how much he lies, how many institutions he craps on, as long as he, Boris, manages to continue with his weird cult.
Well, I might ask you about the actual cult in a moment, but before that, you've sat on select committees and you would have been following these events very closely. Most people so far surprised, perhaps initially, by how far they went in terms of the sanction or the suggested sanction, and then upon consideration and upon study of the report, probably not that surprised after all. But it is, I mean, it's a biggie, isn't it? 90 days and a withdrawal of a parliamentary pass being suggested. Have they gone a little further than perhaps you expected?
I think they've definitely gone further. I think they have been made even angrier by the way that he's attacked the committee and the way that he tried to resign before they suspended him. He was jumping before he was pushed, and that sort of added to their sense of fury. But it's also important to remember, as people have pointed out, that the majority of this committee are Conservative Party members,
Yes, of course.
including, and quite a broad variety from different ages, different intakes, different parts of the Conservative Party, ranging from Brexiteers through to people who are more on the Remain side. And the fact that they're all unanimous in it just demonstrates their sense as parliamentarians of disgust at the way Boris Johnson lied to them.
Which brings us to the cult. I'm not this morning, plenty of other people will, for good or for ill, giving much weight or attention to his tantrum, to his response that was probably itself a contempt of Parliament, given that it was made available to people before the report was. But when you look at former colleagues still clinging on, do you have an understanding of them that perhaps the rest that would elude the rest of us? These are people that you broke bread with, that you went through the lobby with, that you followed whips with. You see some of these people now still clinging to the carcass of Johnson's career. Do you get it in any way?
It's very, very strange, very strange. And some of these people, I remember back in 2019 when I was trying to run for the leadership against Boris,
Of course.
were not as fanatical about him then. I mean, back in the day, I remember one of them who's been caught up in a lot of this, saying to me, when I said, how can you possibly support Boris? He's a terrible human being. He's going to be a terrible prime minister. He said to me, yeah, that may or may not be true, Rory, but he's a winner. He's going to win. And what seems to have happened is they've gone from seeing him as a kind of useful tool for winning elections into seeing him as the kind of representative of everything they care about in the world.
Yeah.
And I guess that is that they've been dragged deeper and deeper. I think having tied themselves to him and defended him in the first 10 or 15 scandals, they almost feel they have no choice other than to continue defending him. A lot of these people, of course, have been rewarded by him. I mean, you need to look at the fact that almost all the people out defending him have got knighthoods from him, or he was trying to put them in the House of Lords. So I think that's another thing to bear in mind here.
Where does that leave the party?
Leaves the party in a terrible situation. I mean, Boris Johnson, in addition to trashing Parliament, insulting the courts, is basically trying to take the Conservative Party down with him.
Do you think so?
Yeah. His fantasy is to take his revenge on Rishi Sunak, prove that he's bigger than anybody. He's almost certainly going to try to provide, if he can't take over the Conservative Party again after the next election, he'll try to create some splinter faction group to get himself back in. And he doesn't care how much damage he's doing, doesn't care that he's insulting the current prime minister, undermining Conservatives' electoral chances, because in the end, it's all about Boris Johnson.
What would you advise Rishi Sunak to do?
I think he's got to lean into who he is. So, I mean, his reputation is for being slightly more steady, understated, professional. He's got to hope that he can let Boris embarrass himself and not get dragged too deeply into this.
And with regard to this, it's hard to imagine what he could say that wouldn't upset or even alienate parts of his own party now.
Yes, although it may be that we're exaggerating how many members of parliament this is.
Yes,
I mean,
of course.
Some of them are resigning in Boris's favour anyway, so they won't be around it very long.
Well, you say that. Some of them have already changed their mind, or at least pressed the delay button until some unspecified point in the future.
Look, and I think the other thing that's going to be tough for him is the vote, because this committee just presents a vote to Parliament, and that vote will really split the Conservative Party between people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who keeps saying, this is all storm in a teacup, it was just a piece of cake.
Sir Jacob, Rory, just to prove your previous point.
Absolutely. And I think he's a very interesting example in this, because he was a guy who, when I joined Parliament with him, was one of the most pompous defenders of the idea of Parliament, kind of big professional backbencher, read all the detailed parliamentary procedures, loved all that stuff. And he's now saying, I think in his latest tweet, Parliament's taking itself too seriously.
Gosh, the irony. I think I'd just thank you there, because we could talk all day, but I appreciate you've got other things that you need to be. Oh, I'll tell you what. One final question, because you are a historian as well, of course, as a politician. Can you put it alongside anything else from British political history? Have you sort of we can call it a scandal. I think that's probably a matter of record. What does it sit beside? What is it up there with?
I think Boris Johnson, I think, is in my mind close to being the worst prime minister I can think of. I mean, going back in history, there were some terrible ones in the 18th century.
Lord North
wasn't up to much, yeah. But I think Boris is in a sense worse, because all the others, even if they were pretty ineffectual, strangely in Britain retained a very strong degree of respect for the institutions.
Or fear. If not respect, then at least fear of the institutions.
Yeah, but I think, I was just talking to John Major yesterday. He's an example of somebody who, he was a conservative. There'll be many listeners who won't like him, but he had a very, very strong sense of what was decent.
Yes.
And I think that sort of stayed with him. And I think that probably would have been true of Clement Attlee on the Labour side. So going back in the day, the only person I think that maybe measures us up, who was an incomparably better politician, more effective prime minister, but had some of the same shakiness and shadiness to him, was Lloyd George, who was clearly pretty corrupt, pretty peculiar back in the 1920s. But apart from that, I'm struggling to find anyone quite as immoral as Boris Johnson occupying that position.
Rory Stewart, many thanks indeed.